In 30 years on this bench, I have never seen a defendant look at a victim and say out loud, in open court, in front of a gallery full of witnesses, "This old man is nobody." I have never seen a courtroom go that quiet. And I have never, in 3 decades, seen what happened next. Because what that young man did not know, what even his own attorneys did not know, was that in the 5th row of that gallery, in full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, sat his father, one of the most decorated generals in the history of the United States Army, watching his son destroy the meaning of every single one of those medals. And the decision that general was about to make, publicly, voluntarily, at enormous personal cost, is the reason I am telling you this story today. If you believe that no family name, no rank, and no amount of inherited status places anyone above justice, please subscribe. I only ask once. Now let me tell you about Harold Washington, and what he deserved that day, and what he finally received. The file landed on my desk on a Monday morning. I set down my coffee when I read the first page and did not pick it up again. The victim was Harold Washington, 80 years old, Korean War veteran, a man who had given this country his youth at 19 years old and had asked for very little in return across the 6 decades since. The defendant was Brandon Mercer, 30 years old, son of General Raymond Mercer, 4-star general, 40 years of decorated service, a name that had appeared in congressional testimony, in presidential briefings, in the citation language of medals that most soldiers spend entire careers never coming close to. To understand what happened in my courtroom, you need to understand what happened on those steps 5 days before. Harold Washington had been to that Veterans Affairs office dozens of times. It was routine. He arrived the way he always arrived, deliberately, without hurry, with his cane and his veteran's cap, and the unhurried dignity of a man who stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. He was moving through the revolving door when Brandon Mercer came up behind him. Brandon was late, not for anything urgent, not for anything that would justify what came next, under any reasonable understanding of how human beings treat each other. Late in the way that men who have never truly been made to wait experience lateness, as something that has been done to them by someone, and that someone will hear about it. He told Washington to move faster. Washington, according to 3 separate witnesses whose accounts were nearly identical, turned slightly, apologized, and continued at his pace. The only pace available to an 80-year-old man with a twice-replaced hip navigating a revolving door with a cane. That was enough for Brandon Mercer. He shoved past him with both hands, not a brush, not an impatient nudge, a deliberate, forceful shove that sent Harold Washington's cane skittering across the concrete and took his legs out from under him. Washington hit the steps hard. His hip fractured on impact, his shoulder dislocated as he tried to break his own fall. The laceration above his eye came from the edge of the step. He lay on the concrete outside the building that exists specifically to serve men like him, and he did not cry out. Witnesses said he made almost no sound at all. Brandon Mercer looked down at him. He straightened his jacket. That detail appeared in all 3 witness statements, the straightening of the jacket. And then he said, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." Then he walked inside. A bystander had been recording for 17 seconds before the shove. The footage captured everything: the shove, the fall, the jacket, the words. Unambiguous. Undeniable. Harold Washington spent 5 days in the hospital. By the time he was discharged, 17 seconds of video had been watched 12 million times. Veterans organizations released statements not just of outrage, but of something that read more like grief as if that footage had made visible something devastating, a generation's sacrifice being dismissed as nobody by someone who had never once been asked to sacrifice anything at all. By the morning of trial, my courtroom was the most heavily attended I had presided over in 30 years. Veterans sat in uniform in the gallery. Gold Star families had driven hours. Journalists filled every press seat, and over everything hung a specific weighted stillness. Not the energy of people who had come to watch a spectacle, the stillness of people who had come to bear witness to something that mattered. I called the court to order and felt the presence of every person in that room settle onto the proceedings. Then the doors opened. Brandon Mercer walked in, dressed in a fitted charcoal suit. His posture was military straight, not from service, but from growing up around it. The inherited bearing of a man who would absorb the appearance of discipline without ever being subject to its demands. His expression was carefully maintained. The composed look of someone who has decided that performing calm is the same as actually having it. He was accompanied by 4 attorneys. He passed Harold Washington on the way to his table. Washington was seated in the gallery, his Korean War veteran's cap on his head, his hip in a brace that made sitting visibly uncomfortable. The faint remnant of the laceration still visible above his eye. He sat with the straight-backed quiet of a man who has long understood that dignity is not something circumstances can take from you unless you surrender it yourself. Brandon Mercer passed within 4 feet of him and did not glance in his direction. Not a flicker of recognition, not a moment's pause, not the smallest acknowledgement that the man in the hip brace was the man he had left on a set of concrete steps. He passed him the way you pass furniture. I watched all of it from the bench. By the time Brandon Mercer reached the defense table and pulled out his chair, my glasses were already off. I called the case and asked how he wished to plead. His lead attorney was on his feet with 2 sentences of preamble. I let him finish and then I cut him off. Counselor, I am asking your client, Mr. Mercer, how do you plead? Brandon straightened, looked at me with those composed eyes. Not guilty, Your Honor. Frankly, I think this charge is a significant overreaction to what was a very minor incident. I set my pen down. I let that phrase, significant overreaction, sit in the air of the courtroom. I wanted every person in that gallery to hear it fully before I responded to it. Mr. Mercer, I said, a man spent 5 days in a hospital. His hip is fractured. His shoulder was dislocated. Would you like to walk me through your definition of a significant overreaction, or shall we continue? He continued. He described Harold Washington as a confused elderly man who had been blocking the entrance and characterized what he had done as incidental contact that unfortunately resulted in a fall. The gallery held itself in rigid, compressed silence, a fury so controlled it had nowhere to go. His lead attorney then rose, with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a career making uncomfortable facts sound like reasonable questions. He walked methodically through the footage angle, the instability of concrete steps for elderly individuals with mobility limitations, and Mr. Washington's own medical history as relevant context. And then, with the seamless transition of someone who had been building toward it, he mentioned General Raymond Mercer, not as a threat, as context, a gentle reminder of the family into which this case had inserted itself. 40 years of decorated service, the institutional weight of the Mercer name, the particular complexity of prosecuting the son of a man who had given so much. The implication moved through the gallery like smoke through a sealed room. Slow, pervasive, impossible to point to directly. I watched it reach the veterans in uniform, and I watched their jaws tighten. Brandon straightened in his chair. Something loosened in his expression. The first release of tension I had seen in him since he walked in. The relief of a man who believes the cavalry has just arrived. I let his attorney finish every sentence. I gave him the full conclusion of every point. Then I set down my pen, folded my hands on the bench, and looked past him to the gallery. Is General Mercer in this courtroom today? The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. From the fifth row of the gallery, a figure rose. Full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder. Every decoration and commendation earned across 40 years of active service, combat ribbons, distinguished service medals, honors from 3 separate administrations, arranged in precise gleaming rows across his chest. He stood at attention. The particular stillness of a man for whom bearing is not performance, but habit. The courtroom did not make a sound. Brandon turned in his chair. The relief drained from his face so completely and so rapidly that what replaced it looked like a different person sitting in that chair. General Mercer walked to the front of the courtroom without being directed. He stood before my bench with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for several days and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, without any of the measured diplomatic distance that had characterized every public statement his office had released since the footage appeared. He said that his son had struck a Korean War veteran outside a building that exists specifically to honor men like Harold Washington. He said there was no camera angle, no medical context, no legal reframing, and no consideration of family name or military rank that changed what was visible in that footage or what it meant. Then he turned to face Harold Washington. He came to full attention, and he rendered a formal military salute. A 4-star general in full dress uniform, saluting an 80-year-old man in a veteran's cap and a hip brace. Washington received it with a stillness that was more eloquent than anything words could have managed. Then General Mercer faced me. "Your Honor," he said, "do not soften this sentence on my account. My son will face every consequence this court provides. That is my order to him and my promise to you." The courtroom did not erupt. It did something rarer and more human than that. It wept. I gave the room a moment. Then I put my glasses back on, straightened the file in front of me, and looked at Brandon Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, I have presided over this courtroom for a long time. I have seen many young men sit where you are sitting. The ones who concern me most are not the ones who are frightened. The ones who concern me most are the ones who are not. You walked into this courtroom today without remorse, without acknowledgement, and without the faintest apparent understanding of what you actually did on those steps. I am going to ensure that understanding arrives." I stood. I walked past the defense table, past the bar, into the gallery, and stopped directly in front of Harold Washington. "Mr. Washington, would you please stand?" He stood. It took him a moment. The hip brace made it slow, and he needed his cane. He did it without complaint and without performance, with the full, unhurried dignity of a man who has been standing back up his entire life. I turned to face Brandon Mercer. "Look at this man," I said. "Look at him carefully, and then tell me again that he was nobody." Brandon looked. The gallery waited. His expression did not change, not a flicker, not a crack. The arrogance was so complete in that moment that several people looked away from him. That told me everything I still needed to know. I returned to the bench. "I find you guilty of assault on an elderly person on all counts, without qualification and without any reduction in consideration of your family name or your father's rank." His lead attorney did not move. There was nothing useful left for him to do. "Here is your sentence. You will serve 120 days in the county correctional facility. You will complete 400 hours of community service at VA hospitals and veteran care homes across this state. Not administrative work, not peripheral support. Direct, face-to-face service to the men and women whose sacrifices you dismissed as nobody. You will attend 1 year of mandatory counseling. You will compose by hand a formal written apology to Harold Washington and read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today. You will record a public video statement, unscripted, unedited, with no attorney present, to be distributed across veteran and military networks nationwide. And you will make a standing annual commitment, arranged through the VA, to speak at veteran outreach programs about privilege, inherited status, and the true cost of contempt. I paused and let every element settle into the record and into the room. From the gallery, General Mercer spoke quietly. "Your Honor, I have one condition of my own to add." I nodded. "Effective today, Brandon's access to every family financial account, every professional connection, and every door that has ever opened because it carried the name Mercer behind it is suspended." He looked at his son directly. "You will stand on what you have built yourself. When we find out what that is, we will go from there." The gavel came down. The silence that followed was the heaviest I have felt in 30 years on this bench. Officers approached the defense table. Brandon stood. He reached instinctively for his jacket, that same habitual smoothing of the lapel that 3 witnesses had described on the steps of a VA. And then his hands stopped mid-motion and dropped to his sides, as if the gesture had suddenly shown him something about himself he was not prepared to see. General Mercer crossed the courtroom and stopped in front of his son. He did not reach for him immediately. He looked at him first. A long, steady, honest inventory. The look of a man accounting for every parental decision, every absence, every indulgence, every moment of his own life that had contributed, however distantly, to this room and this morning. Then he gripped his son's shoulder with one hand. "I have given orders," he said quietly, "that cost men their lives. I have made decisions in the field that I have carried every day since. But this is the hardest order I have ever given. Face this, all of it, every hour, every day, every conversation you do not want to have. Come out the other side, someone worthy of what you have spent your whole life benefiting from without ever earning." Brandon's composure broke completely, all at once, the way things collapse when the last support gives way. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." The general pulled him close. "I know. Now show me." Across the courtroom, Harold Washington rose from his seat, slowly, with his cane, with his hip brace, with everything he was and everything he had survived. He looked at General Mercer across that packed, weeping room, and he rendered a single, small, deliberate nod. The veterans in the gallery rose to their feet, one by one, without a word spoken between them. Nobody saluted. Nobody needed to. 6 months later, Brandon Mercer walked out of the county correctional facility carrying a single bag. There was no car service waiting, no attorney with next steps, no family connection standing ready to smooth the transition. He had asked for none of those things. The 400 hours at VA hospitals and veteran care homes had not been performed at a comfortable distance. He had sat beside beds. He had listened. He had spent hundreds of hours in the company of men Harold Washington's age and older, men who moved slowly and remembered everything, who had given years of their lives to something larger than themselves and received, in many cases, very little in return. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those hours and all those conversations, something in Brandon Mercer had shifted in a way that no courtroom sentence alone could have produced. He and Harold Washington met at a Veterans Community Luncheon 8 weeks after his release. Both men had requested the meeting independently through separate channels without knowing the other had already made the same request. What passed between them that afternoon remained private. Both described it afterward using the same word, healing. Washington became, in the months that followed, something close to an informal mentor, meeting Brandon occasionally, offering the kind of guidance that can only come from someone who has chosen grace over grievance and understands exactly what that choice costs. Brandon's unscripted video statement, recorded in a plain room, no styling, no preparation, no attorney, was viewed more than 5 million times and became required viewing at several military institutions before the year was out. He speaks quarterly at veteran outreach programs now. He tells his story without softening a single detail, without excusing a single moment, and without leaving out the part where the man he knocked to the ground on a set of concrete steps chose, without any obligation to do so, to help him become someone better. General Raymond Mercer attends every session. He sits in the back row, full uniform, saying nothing, watching his son become, one measured step at a time, someone finally worthy of both of them. I have thought about this case every day since that gavel came down. I think about General Mercer rising from the fifth row of my gallery, not to defend his son, not to leverage 40 years of service on behalf of the family name, but to stand as witness to the consequences his son had earned, and to ensure with his own presence that nothing softened them. I believe it may be the most courageous thing I have ever watched happen in this courtroom. Not because it was easy, because it cost him everything a parent fears losing, and he did it anyway. I think about Harold Washington, 80 years old, hip in a brace, laceration still faintly visible above his eye, rising slowly from his seat with his cane to offer that nod across a packed and weeping courtroom to the father of the man who put him in a hospital. That gesture was not required of him. It was not expected. It was entirely, freely given, and it was the most powerful thing that happened in that room. More powerful than any ruling I issued, more powerful than any statement made from the bench. Because grace is not weakness. It is the hardest thing a human being can produce, and Harold Washington had been producing it his entire life, long before that morning on those steps, and long after. And I think about a young man who walked into my courtroom having never once in 30 years been genuinely required to account for himself, who walked out of a correctional facility carrying the first thing he had ever truly earned, the slow, irreversible knowledge of who he actually is, and who, with enough honesty and enough work, he is still capable of becoming. Real honor is not inherited. It is not a row of decorations on someone else's chest. It is not access to the right last name, or the right connections, or the right doors. It is what you are when no one is watching. It is what you choose when the choice costs you something real. Harold Washington demonstrated that on a set of concrete steps without even being given the choice of whether to. General Mercer demonstrated it in the fifth row of a courtroom, in front of the country, at the cost of the image he had spent 40 years building. And Brandon Mercer, slowly, imperfectly, one VA hospital visit at a time, is learning what it means to demonstrate it himself. That is the only version of this story that matters. Not the footage, not the sentence. The part that came after. The part where a person, finally stripped of everything they did not earn, discovers what they actually have and decides what to do with it. If this story moved you, if you believe that no rank, no name, and no inherited privilege places anyone above the reach of justice or the reach of what they owe to others, share it today. And if you'd like to stay for more stories from 30 years on this bench, I'll be here. The door is always open.